She wore a soldier's uniform, but beneath the ribbons and rank was a silence no one noticed. He was a single dad, grieving guarded, and never expecting that one seat on the plane could change everything. When she whispered, "I'm alone," he didn't hesitate. He leaned closer and said, "Then come with me." What followed wasn't just a journey across the sky, it was a journey home. If stories like this stir something in your heart, we invite you to stay a while. Subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more true-to-life tales of hope, healing, and the quiet miracles that begin when someone chooses to stay. Now let's begin. I can't sit here. Please, can we switch seats? Holden Cole looked up from fastening his daughter's drawing back into his worn leather journal. The voice came from the woman now standing in the aisle, her hands trembling as she gripped the overhead bin for balance. Her uniform gave her away Air Force blues, slightly faded. Her eyes, however, told a different story, wide-haunted like she'd just seen something no one else on this plane could. Holden glanced down. Seat 19A, his seat. She was staring at it like it held a ghost. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, noticing his confusion. "I know it sounds strange. It's just, I can't sit there. I'll pay you. I just can't." "Hey." Holden's voice was gentle but steady, the way he used to talk to June when she woke from nightmares. "Take a breath. You okay?" "No," she whispered, then clenched her jaw. "Yes, just not in that seat." Holden stood slowly, his 6-foot frame unfolding like a man who'd carried too much for too long. He looked her in the eye. She didn't flinch, but her pupils danced. He glanced down the row. Seat 19B, his seat. "Why that seat?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. Then she reached into her duffel bag, a heavy olive canvas bag scuffed with age, and pulled out a piece of folded, wrinkled paper. She held it out but didn't let go. "I wrote my suicide note on that seat, a year ago. Never mailed it. Never told anyone. But I remember the feel of the tray table, the way the light hit that seat, the smell of engine fuel and recycled air. It was the last place I planned to exist." Holden didn't say a word. The hum of the plane faded behind the weight of her confession. Then, without warning, she shoved the paper back in the bag and turned. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It's fine. I'll sit somewhere else." "No," Holden interrupted. His voice was calm, steady. "You're not running from that seat. You're going to sit down, and I'm going to sit next to you." She blinked. "Why would you do that?" He offered the smallest smile. "Because I've sat in that seat too." She hesitated, then almost reluctantly slid into 19A, her shoulders rigid, her breath shallow. Holden settled into 19B beside her. The captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing departure. As the plane began its taxi, the woman sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale. "I'm Avery," she said softly without turning her head. "Holden," he replied. "Single dad, recovering blacksmith. Not great with small talk, but decent at sitting in silence if that's what you need." Avery let out a short, involuntary laugh. "Blacksmith. Yep. That's not something you hear every day. Neither is a woman telling a stranger she once planned to die in this exact seat." She looked at him, startled. Holden's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't trying to be cruel, just honest, just present. "I lost my wife to cancer," he said. 4 years ago. She didn't want to go. She fought like hell. Some nights I wished I could trade places with her. But I had June, our daughter. So I stayed. And some days, staying is the bravest thing you can do." Avery swallowed hard. She opened her bag again. The dog tag clinked gently as she moved. "Stone, Opus, US Army, hanging from a zipper, like a forgotten medal." Holden glanced at it. "Here's." Avery nodded, eyes glassy. His name was Cole Stone. We were engaged. He didn't come back from our last mission. I did. That's what broke me, coming back when he didn't. Silence. Then Holden spoke so quietly she almost missed it. Survivor's guilt is the second heaviest thing in the world. Avery turned to him. And the first, loneliness. The plane began to lift. Avery's eyes shut tight. Holden gently reached over, not touching her, but offering the space between them like a bridge. I'm not here to fix you, he said. But if sitting here helps you breathe again, I'll sit here as long as it takes. For the first time, Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her shoulders eased just a little. The dog tag swung like a pendulum between past and present. And somewhere over the clouds, between who she was and who she feared she'd never be again, Avery Quinn sat in the seat she once wanted to die in, next to a man who had every reason to walk away, but didn't. She turned toward the window, her voice barely audible. Thank you for not letting me run. Holden leaned back in his seat, eyes on the fading skyline. Everyone deserves someone to sit beside them in the worst seat of their life. And in that sacred silence between strangers, something shifted. Not a rescue, not a romance, just a beginning. A kind of quiet miracle that only happens when someone chooses to stay. The silence between them lingered long after the wheels touched down in Missoula. Avery didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. The bag on her lap remained tightly zipped, yet Holden could still hear the faint metallic clink of the dog tag each time she exhaled, like a ghost gently rattling its chains. The rest of the plane stirred to life, passengers stretching seat belts, unclicking the usual rustle of relief that came with landing. But for Avery and Holden, it felt like the world had paused for a few extra seconds, long enough to take one more breath before stepping back into reality. As they filed out, Holden noticed Avery hesitating at the gate exit. Her eyes were locked on the glass wall ahead, where travelers reunited with loved ones, hugs, tears, hands holding flowers and homemade signs. She had no one waiting. Holden touched her arm lightly. You hungry? Avery looked at him confused. No, I'm fine. That wasn't the question, he said gently. I asked if you're hungry. There was a pause. Then finally she nodded. They ended up at a tiny diner a few miles from the airport. One of those old places with red vinyl booths, pie behind glass, and a waitress who called everyone Han. Holden ordered coffee and 2 slices of apple pie, warm with cheddar melted on top the proper Montana way, he said with a smirk. Avery gave a weak smile but said nothing. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Avery pushed the pie around on her plate. Then she spoke. I haven't been back here in a long time. Missoula, she shook her head. Anywhere outside of base, outside of routine. Holden nodded slowly. Routine can feel like a life raft, until it turns into a cage. She blinked, surprised by his words. He continued. After my wife died, I ironed my shirts every night, even t-shirts, just to feel like I still had control over something. Avery's lips tugged upward for a moment. I color-code my socks. Deployment habit. My bunkmate thought I was neurotic. I just needed the order. Holden took a sip of coffee, eyes steady on hers. Tell me about him. She didn't flinch this time. Her fork hovered in the air, then lowered. Cole Stone, she said. He was quieter than most. Didn't bark orders, didn't show off. But when he walked into a room, people stood straighter. Not because they feared him, because they trusted him. Her voice softened. He believed in missions. But more than that, he believed in people, even when they didn't believe in themselves. She reached into her duffel and slowly, with reverence, pulled out the old dog tag. The metal caught the light. Scratched. Worn. Real. I wasn't supposed to come back, she said. We hit a storm, lost our bearings. The helicopter went down in the mountains. He pulled me out of the wreckage, shoved the emergency beacon into my hand, and made me promise to live. Her eyes brimmed, but the tears didn't fall. I kept the promise, but I didn't feel alive, just suspended. Holden's voice was low, almost inaudible, and now Avery looked at him for a long moment. Now, I'm not sure, but I didn't run from 19A today. That's something. Holden leaned forward slightly. Maybe surviving wasn't the end of the promise. Maybe living is. The dog tag trembled in her hand. I used to sleep with this under my pillow, she said, like it could protect me. But the truth is, it became a weight, a reminder of what I couldn't do. You mean save him? Holden asked. Avery nodded. I trained for every scenario, every emergency. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the person you love gives up their life for yours. She looked down. I haven't let anyone close since. Not family. Not friends. I couldn't stand the idea of losing again. So I became invisible. Holden rested his forearms on the table, his expression kind, but unwavering. You're not invisible. I see you, Avery Quinn. Not the uniform. Not the loss. You. She looked up at him. Why do you care? Because someone once sat beside me when I couldn't breathe. A hospice nurse. She didn't say much, but she stayed. It made all the difference. He paused. And because I have a daughter, who still asks why the stars go out sometimes. I don't want her to grow up thinking the answer is because they die. I want her to know the stars come back, sometimes in different skies. Avery's throat tightened. She swallowed hard, but her next words came out almost a whisper. What if I don't know how to come back? Holden smiled gently. Then maybe you don't have to come back. Maybe you just start from where you are. They sat quietly, the pie cooling between them. Then Avery did something she hadn't done in a long time. She slid the dog tag across the table. Hold this for me. Holden looked at it, then her. You sure? She nodded. If I'm going to start again, I need both hands free. Holden picked up the tag warm from her skin, and in that tiny diner beneath the flickering neon sign and the smell of coffee and apple pie, a woman who once wrote a goodbye letter began to write something else, a new page, a new paragraph, a story not of endings, but of staying. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as they stepped out into the cold Montana afternoon. The sky hung low with soft gray clouds, and the air smelled faintly of pine and chimney smoke. Holden tucked the dog tag into his coat pocket as Avery hugged her arms around herself, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she had just let go. She had handed over her last tether to the past, and now, strangely, she felt both hollow and light. Where are you staying? Holden asked, as they reached his battered Chevy pickup. Avery hesitated. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Holden didn't respond right away. He opened the passenger door and waited. I have a spare room, he said simply. Avery blinked. You barely know me. I know enough, he said, to know that you don't need a motel tonight. You need a door that doesn't close on you. She stood there, 1 foot still on the sidewalk. You don't have to fix me. I'm not trying to, he said, just offering you a warm bed and a decent cup of coffee in the morning. You get to say no. Avery studied his face. No pity, no agenda, just a quiet steadiness that felt like shelter. She got in. The drive to Holden's place took 20 minutes. His property sat on the edge of a snow-dusted valley flanked by pines and a weathered barn. The house was a modest log cabin, with smoke curling gently from the chimney. A faded swing set sat in the yard, rust creaking in the wind. As they pulled up, the front door swung open, and a small figure darted out. Daddy. A girl of about 8, all tangled chestnut curls, and oversized sweater sleeves, launched herself into Holden's arms before noticing Avery. She stopped short, blinking up at the stranger. Holden ruffled the girl's hair. "June, this is Miss Avery. She's staying with us tonight." June tilted her head like a curious bird. "You're the soldier Daddy said might need pie." Avery choked on a laugh. "That sounds about right." June reached for her hand with complete confidence. "Come on. I saved the last cinnamon roll for you." Inside, the warmth wrapped around Avery like a quilt. The cabin was small but cozy, full of soft light and lived-in charm. Photos lined the mantel, some of Holden with June, some of a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. "Your wife," Avery asked softly. Holden nodded. "Emma. She passed when June was 4. Cancer." Avery's voice was quiet. "I'm sorry." "Me too," he said. He didn't linger on the sorrow. Instead, he handed her a mug of hot cider and pointed to a chair near the fireplace. "Sit. Rest. Let June do the talking. She's good at that." As if on cue, June plopped down beside her with a pile of crayons and a sketch pad. "Do you want me to draw your helicopter?" Avery blinked. "What? You're a soldier. Soldiers fly helicopters, right?" Avery smiled. "Sometimes." "Cool. I'll draw it pink." Holden chuckled from the kitchen. "You're in good hands now." Later that evening, after June was tucked in and the dishes washed, Avery stood by the window staring into the snow-blurred night. Holden handed her a folded blanket. "Spare rooms through there," he said. "It's small, but the bed's soft." Avery held the blanket to her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" Holden leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Because you stayed," he said simply. "You stayed in that seat. You let someone sit beside you. That takes more courage than most people have left." Avery looked down. "I'm not brave. I just didn't want to run anymore." He took a step closer, his voice low and certain. "You don't have to be brave all at once, just long enough to get through one more night. Then you do it again tomorrow." Avery's throat tightened. She nodded. "I'll stay one night," she said. "Maybe 2. But then I'll figure things out." Holden didn't press. "That's fair." She paused. "Thank you, Holden, for the pie, and the blanket, and not asking too much." He smiled. "You don't owe me anything, Avery. You're not a project. You're a person." She stood in the doorway of the spare room for a long time after he left. The bed was neatly made, the pillow fluffed. A small lamp glowed beside a stack of books. One of them was a collection of letters from soldiers in wartime. She picked it up, ran her fingers over the worn cover. Then she pulled out a pen from her duffel bag, and for the first time in over a year, she began to write. Not a goodbye, not a report, just thoughts, words she hadn't let herself say aloud. The last line read, "I think I'm starting to believe that not every home is where you were born. Some homes are people, and sometimes they find you when you least expect it." She folded the paper, slipped it into the front pocket of the borrowed blanket, and turned off the light. For the first time in months, Avery Quinn fell asleep without her boots on. When Avery awoke the next morning, it took a moment to remember where she was. The sun streamed through linen curtains, warm against the pine walls. For the first time in months, there was no barracks, whistle, no sterile gray light, no boots clunking down cement halls. Only the muffled sound of a child humming somewhere down the hall, and the faint, comforting scent of coffee and maple syrup. She sat up slowly. The blanket Holden had given her was still wrapped around her like a shield, though now it felt more like a cocoon. A knock on the doorframe pulled her back. June stood there in rainbow-striped socks and a too-big hoodie that nearly swallowed her hands. She clutched a spiral notebook to her chest. "Hey," the girl said. "I made you a picture." Avery smiled and held out her hand. June padded over and sat on the edge of the bed like she'd done it 100 times before. I asked Daddy if you were a real warrior. He said yes. He said you were tired and brave, and that's what real warriors look like. Avery blinked hard. June opened the notebook to a page where a child's drawing sprawled across in bright marker lines. There was a helicopter crooked and pink, hovering above a figure with a ponytail and a big smile holding hands with a smaller girl. "That's you," June pointed. "And that's me. I drew you brave," Avery's voice caught. "It's beautiful, June. I put stars on your shirt," the girl added seriously. "Because warriors deserve stars. Even the tired ones." Avery reached out and pulled June gently into a hug. The child's warmth against her chest was unlike anything she'd felt since Cole. Since she'd let someone rest against her without the fear of being torn away. She held the hug a beat longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she whispered. Later in the kitchen, Holden was flipping pancakes while humming an old blues tune under his breath. Avery stepped in, notebook still in her hand. "I think June might be a better therapist than the VA." He grinned without turning. "She has that effect." "I meant to leave this morning," Avery said quietly. Holden glanced over his shoulder. But she shrugged. "But she drew stars on my shirt. Kind of hard to walk away after that." He slid a plate onto the counter. "Then don't." She met his eyes. There was no pressure in them, only the kind of quiet certainty that didn't ask for anything in return. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said. "I don't want pity. Not offering any." Avery looked down. "I'm still broken, Holden." He stepped closer. "Everyone is. Some of us just hide it better." There was a pause. The sound of the coffee pot bubbling filled the room. Then Holden added softly, "But if you let someone help carry a piece of it, it doesn't feel so heavy." They spent the day together, like it wasn't strange at all. Like a soldier staying with a widowed blacksmith, and his precocious daughter was the most natural thing in the world. Avery helped June build a snow fort in the backyard, their boots crunching in fresh powder. The little girl gave out orders like a general, and Avery followed each one with mock salutes and half smiles that slowly became real. When they came back inside, soaked and laughing, Holden handed them each a mug of hot cocoa and shook his head. "I've seen you fly into combat zones," he said to Avery, "but I've never seen you take marching orders from an 8-year-old." "She's terrifying," Avery replied, blowing steam off her drink. "I think she could lead a battalion." June grinned proudly and curled up with a blanket by the fire sketchbook in her lap. Holden turned to Avery. "You want to see the forge?" Avery blinked. "Forge? Like fire and steel?" He nodded. "I told you I'm a blacksmith." She followed him out to a barn behind the cabin. The interior was warmer than expected, the walls lined with tools and hammers and curved bits of metal in various states of becoming. In the center sat the anvil, scarred, solid, eternal. A furnace glowed orange nearby, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden floor. Holden picked up a small half-formed blade. "This was supposed to be a kitchen knife," he said. "But I overheated it and cracked the edge. Most folks would toss it." "Why don't you?" Avery asked. He held it up the flawed edge, catching the light. "Because I've learned that the pieces with the most damage also have the most character. Sometimes you reshape them, sometimes you repurpose them, but you never throw them out just because they didn't turn out the way you planned." He looked at her then. Not the soldier, not the guest, just Avery. "You remind me of this blade," he said. "Stronger than you think. Not ruined, just unfinished." Her breath caught. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "The letter." I never mailed. From seat 19A. Holden opened it slowly, a few lines short and raw written in a hand that trembled. I don't know who I am without him. I don't know if I want to find out. If someone finds this, I'm sorry. Holden read it once, then twice. He didn't fold it back. He didn't hand it back either. He walked over to the furnace and without a word tossed it into the fire. Avery gasped. You don't need that anymore, he said gently. That chapter's closed. The paper curled and darkened, then flared bright before vanishing into ash. Avery stared into the fire. She felt something shift, not a grand awakening, not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet exhale she hadn't realized she was holding. A release. That night, when she crawled into bed, she found something tucked under her pillow, June's pink helicopter drawing. A new line had been added in the corner, in shaky little kid handwriting. You don't have to fly alone anymore. Avery pressed the paper to her heart. For the first time since the crash, she didn't dream of falling. The snow came heavy that morning. It clung to the window panes like lace and blanketed the old swing set in the yard. Inside the cabin, the world was still. Holden sat at the kitchen table oiling a folding knife. Avery stirred cinnamon into pancake batter. June sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to braid her doll's hair. It felt like peace. Not the kind soldiers write home about, but the kind you don't realize you've been starving for until you're right in the middle of it. Then came the knock. 3 short raps on the door firm direct. Holden and Avery locked eyes. He stood wiping his hands on a dish towel. She froze, the ladle hovering midair. Holden opened the door. A man stood on the porch, snowflakes collecting on his hat brim. Army jacket, square jaw, hard eyes. Lieutenant Quinn Avery stepped forward slowly. Yes, I'm Staff Sergeant Blake Townsend. We served together in the 219th. I've been looking for you. Avery stiffened, why he stepped inside at Holden's nod. I'm not here on orders, Blake said. This is personal. Avery folded her arms. Go on. Blake reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. This is from Captain Dana Wright. She passed 6 months ago. I promised her I'd deliver this to you. Avery felt the floor tilt. Dana. The name hit like a body blow. She was gone, Avery murmured. Blake nodded solemnly. Pancreatic cancer. She kept it quiet. She wanted to go on her terms. Avery took the envelope, her fingers trembling. She wrote you this. Blake continued and added something to her will. She named you as legal guardian for her daughter. The room went silent. Holden straightened slowly. June sat up, eyes wide. I didn't even know she had a child, Avery whispered. She kept the girl in Virginia with her sister Blake said. But her sister's in treatment now. Can't care for the kid. Avery's voice dropped. Why me? Blake looked her in the eyes. Because Dana trusted you. Because she said if anything ever happened, she wanted her daughter with someone who knew what it meant to fight and survive. Avery stared at the envelope like it might catch fire in her hands. She's 4, Blake added. Name's Sophie. Holden stepped beside her. You okay? Avery didn't answer. She was already walking toward the door. Outside, the cold slapped her awake. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the barn, where the wind howled low through the trees. She stood with her back to the cabin, the unopened letter clutched tight in her gloved hand. She had come here to rest, to be invisible for a while, to gather the pieces of herself, not take on a child, a life. But wasn't that the curse of survivors? You keep being handed reasons to live? Holden's voice came behind her soft, unpressing. You don't have to read it right now. She turned. I can't do this. I'm barely keeping myself upright. You don't have to do it all today. She doesn't even know me. You didn't know June either, he said quietly. But look where you are now. That's different. Why, Avery's throat tightened. Because this time, I have a choice. And what if I choose wrong? Holden stepped closer. There's no wrong choice here, Avery, just a hard one. She looked down at the envelope again, then slowly tore it open. Dana's handwriting filled the page. Familiar loops, confident strokes. It was dated 3 months before her death. Avery, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And I know you're furious I never told you about Sophie. I kept her a secret because I was afraid of losing her. I've seen what war does to mothers. But you, Avery, you loved fiercely. You were the bravest among us, not just in the field, but in the silence that followed. I need you to do one more brave thing for me. Be her home. Avery folded the letter slowly. The wind whipped at the corners, but she held it firm. Holden watched her, his eyes steady. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. But Avery already knew. That evening after Blake left with a promise to return the next day with Sophie, Avery sat on the back porch, her breath clouding in the cold air. June padded out in pajamas, dragging her blanket behind her. Are you sad? She asked, climbing into Avery's lap. Avery wrapped the blanket around them both. I'm scared, she said honestly. About the little girl, Avery nodded. Because you don't know how to be a mom, Avery smiled. Something like that. June leaned her head against her shoulder. Well, you can practice on me if you want. Avery's heart squeezed so tightly she thought it might break. I think I already have. They sat in silence until the stars came out, and for the first time in years, Avery didn't feel like a soldier or a survivor. She felt like a beginning. The next morning, a winter hush blanketed the valley. Snow piled soft on the roof, muffling sound and slowing time. Holden stood at the kitchen sink, drying a plate, when the truck pulled into the drive. He watched through the frosted window as Blake climbed out, opened the passenger door, and gently lifted a small girl, bundled in a purple coat, with floppy mittens. She clung to him tightly, her face buried in his collar. Avery stood on the porch, already, arms crossed against the wind, but unmoving. June peeked from behind the curtain. Is that her? Holden nodded. June squinted. She's tiny. Yeah, Holden said. She is. Outside, Avery's boots crunched in the snow as she walked toward Blake. Sophie turned her head just enough to see the stranger approaching. Her cheeks were pink from cold, her eyes glassy and wide. Blake whispered something into Sophie's ear, and then gently placed her on the porch. She stood there, her mittened hands clenched tightly at her sides. Avery crouched to eye level. Hi, Sophie. The girl didn't answer. Her bottom lip quivered. I'm Avery, she said softly. Your mom was my best friend. Sophie sniffled. Mama said your name when she got sleepy. Avery's breath caught. She told me you had stars on your jacket. Avery smiled a little broken. I still do. She opened her coat to reveal her Air Force patch. Sophie stared, then reached forward with a hesitant mitten and touched it. I like stars, she whispered. I do too, Avery said. Would you like to come inside? June saved you a cinnamon roll. Sophie looked up at Blake, who nodded. Then she reached for Avery's hand. It was small, fragile, but firm. Avery blinked fast to keep her vision clear and led the girl inside. The first hours were quiet. Sophie didn't speak much, only nodded or shook her head in response to questions. She sat curled in the armchair, legs tucked beneath her, clutching a soft blue elephant she refused to let go of. June brought over crayons and gently placed them on the table. We don't have to talk, she said to Sophie. You can just color if you want. Sophie slid off the chair and knelt beside her. For a while they sat like that, two girls from different losses, finding something wordless between them. Avery stood in the kitchen watching from a distance, Her hand trembled slightly on the countertop. "You okay?" Holden asked. She nodded slowly. "I think I expected it to be harder. It might be, but you're not doing it alone." Avery exhaled. "That's what terrifies me." Holden gave her a sideways glance. "Because if it's good, it can be lost." She didn't answer. He understood anyway. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, June, in her usual tangle of blankets, Sophie curled up in the guest room with the elephant still clutched to her chest. Avery sat on the back steps, arms wrapped around her knees. Holden brought out 2 mugs of tea and sat beside her. "You didn't have to take her in," he said. "I know. She would have gone to a foster home. Maybe ended up okay. Maybe not." "I know." He sipped his tea. "So why did you?" Avery stared at the dark tree line beyond the fields. "Because I've been the child no one came back for." Her voice was barely audible. "Dana came back for me once, when I froze up during a drill. She chewed out a sergeant twice her size to protect me. Said I was worth more than I thought." Holden said nothing. The wind rustled softly through the trees. "She left me her daughter," Avery whispered. "She didn't ask me to be perfect. Just to try." Holden looked at her. "You think trying's not enough. I'm afraid trying won't be." He set down his mug and turned to face her. "You didn't have to stay in that seat on the plane. But you did. You didn't have to come to this cabin. But you did. You didn't have to read Dana's letter. But you did." Avery looked at him unsure. Holden's voice was steady. "You keep choosing to stay, even when it's hard. That's not failing, Avery. That's showing up." She laughed, softly bitter. "I'm terrified every second." He smiled. "Good. Means it matters." They sat in silence for a while until Avery leaned her head gently on his shoulder. "I don't know if I'll be good at this." "You don't have to be good," Holden said, resting his chin lightly against her hair. "You just have to be here." Later that night, Avery crept into Sophie's room. Moonlight spilled across the bed in soft blue hues. The girl slept on her side, breathing evenly, the elephant tucked beneath her chin. Avery sat on the floor beside her. She pulled a small object from her pocket, the dog tag Holden had kept since that day in the diner. She turned it over in her hands. C. Stone, U.S. Army. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of it like a stone. Tonight, it felt like memory, not a chain. She reached for the tiny desk in the corner and took out a piece of paper. Then, in her neat cursive, she wrote, "Dear Dana, I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm here. I see her. I'll protect her. I'll be the door that stays open. I promise." She folded the letter and placed it beneath Sophie's pillow next to the blue elephant. As she stood to leave, Sophie stirred. "Miss Avery." Avery froze. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie's voice was sleepy. "Do you live here too?" Now, Avery hesitated, then smiled. "I think I do." And just like that, a soldier became something else. Not just a survivor, but a mother in the making. The days that followed fell into a rhythm awkward at first, like learning a new dance with mismatched steps. But gradually, something softer began to take root in the ordinary. Mornings began with the scent of cinnamon toast and the gentle thud of small feet scampering down the hallway. June and Sophie, though different in every way, found a quiet alliance over crayons, dolls, and whispered secrets. One talked too much, the other hardly at all. But they moved together like puzzle pieces, discovering how they fit. Avery watched them from the doorway some mornings, coffee in hand, wondering how a cabin that once echoed with silence now pulsed with life. And chaos. And graham cracker crumbs. The transformation felt fragile, as if one wrong move would collapse it all. She'd told herself she was only staying until Sophie settled, but as she folded laundry with June giggling beside her, or helped Sophie zip her jacket before sledding down the backyard hill, Avery felt something impossible forming in her chest. Hope. It terrified her. One afternoon, while the girls were building snow castles outside, Holden found Avery in the barn standing in front of the forge. She wasn't doing anything, just staring at the dormant anvil, her hands in her coat pockets. "You look like you want to punch it," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "I kind of do," she replied. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "No, just a person." She glanced at him. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending to be better than you are?" Holden leaned against the workbench. "Every damn day." Avery let out a breath. "I feel like I'm playing house. Like this isn't real. Like Sophie's going to wake up and realize I'm not her mom. I'm not even her family." Holden tilted his head. "You fed her, tucked her in, kissed her scraped knee, and stayed up all night when she had that fever. That's just what anyone would do." "No," he said quietly. "That's what you did." She ran a hand through her hair. "I don't know what I'm doing, Holden. Neither do I," he admitted. "But you don't have to know. You just have to keep showing up." She looked down at the floor. "Some days I feel like I'm back in basic. Only no one's barking orders, and I'm terrified I'll fail without someone yelling at me." Holden walked over to the anvil and picked up a half-shaped horseshoe. He held it out. "Here." Avery frowned. "What am I supposed to do with that? Mess it up?" She blinked. "Excuse me. Go ahead. Burn it. Bend it wrong. Hit it too hard. Doesn't matter." She hesitated. "Most people think blacksmithing is about precision," he continued. "But really, it's about damage control. About knowing how much you can reshape something before it breaks. And if it does, you start over." She took the horseshoe slowly. "And if you're lucky," Holden said, "you realize it's the mistakes that make it beautiful." Avery turned the metal in her hand. It was rough, uneven, but solid. Like her. That evening, Sophie came to Avery with a book in her hands. "Can you read this one?" she asked, holding up a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. Avery sat on the couch, pulled Sophie into her lap, and began. She read the familiar story in a quiet voice, stumbling a little, when she reached the part where the skin horse talks about becoming real. "Real isn't how you are made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you." Sophie leaned her head against Avery's chest. Avery swallowed and kept going. "It doesn't happen all at once. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen to people who break easily." Her voice broke. Sophie turned and looked up at her. "You okay?" Avery nodded, blinking fast. "Yeah, just learning how to be real." Sophie smiled sleepily. "You already are." And in that moment, Avery Quinn, once a pilot, once a ghost of her former self, understood something she hadn't dared to believe. She wasn't becoming Sophie's replacement for a mother. She was becoming Sophie's mother. That night, Avery stood alone in the barn, the dog tag in her hand. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked to the corner drawer, took out a small velvet box, and placed the tag inside with a folded note. She whispered aloud as she closed it. "I kept my promise, Cole, but now I need both hands for what comes next." She placed the box on a high shelf and left it there, not forgotten, but no longer needed for survival. In the hallway outside the girl's bedroom, Holden found her leaning against the wall. "I heard you finished the book," he said softly. Avery looked up. She fell asleep before I could close the last page. "That's usually how the best chapters end," Holden replied. Avery smiled tiredly. "I feel like I'm learning everything for the first time." He stepped closer. "Good," he said. "That means you're alive." They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them shrinking without effort. Then Avery said something she hadn't said in years. "I'm glad I stayed." Holden's voice was barely a whisper. "So am I." And in that quiet moment, without a kiss, without a confession, Without fanfare, something real settled between them. Not just affection, but foundation. Not just warmth, but home. It was a clear night, the first in weeks. The snow had stopped falling, and the clouds had finally pulled back like curtains revealing the stage of the sky. Stars scattered above the pine trees like forgotten diamonds. The kind of sky that made you stop mid-step and forget just for a moment whatever pain you were carrying. Avery stood on the back porch, wrapped in June's old fleece blanket, staring upward. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until a voice beside her spoke. "You know the names of any of those Holden's boots," crunched against the snow as he joined her. "I used to," she said. "We had stargazing drills in flight school. They taught us how to navigate by the constellations. But I forgot most of them." He pointed to the horizon. "That one's Orion. Belt and all." She tilted her head. "That's the one I remember." "Why, 'cause I used to imagine Cole standing up there," she said softly, "like a sentinel, watching over the rest of us. He had this way of making you feel safe, like no matter what storm hit, he'd fly you home." Holden looked at her in the dark, but didn't speak. She swallowed. "I used to think he was the brave one, but now I think maybe bravery is choosing to stay. Not flying, not fighting, just staying. Day after day." "Then you're the bravest person I know," Holden said. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder beneath the stars. Inside the house, the girls were supposed to be asleep, but the faint sound of giggling echoed down the hall. Avery smiled and turned toward the door. Holden grinned. "I'll get them." "No," she said, quickly touching his arm. "Let me." She padded barefoot across the wooden floors, soft as a ghost, and peeked into the room. June and Sophie were both under the covers, flashlights beaming onto pages of a picture book. June sat up when she saw Avery. "We weren't being loud," she said, immediately wide-eyed. Avery raised an eyebrow. "You're reading at." She glanced at the clock, 9:42 at night. Sophie clutched her elephant tighter. "Just one more story." Avery crossed her arms, mock stern. "One more. Then lights out." June scooted over, patting the mattress. "You can read it." Avery sat on the edge of the bed, tucking Sophie's hair gently behind her ear. She opened the book and read in a quiet, steady voice. Halfway through, Sophie's head dropped against her arm, breath slow and even. Avery didn't stop reading. When she finished, she leaned down and kissed the girl's forehead. June whispered, "You're really good at this." "Good at what, being a mom?" Avery froze. June shrugged sleepily. "Just saying." Back in the hallway, Holden weighted hands in his pockets. "She call you Mom?" Yet he asked. "No," Avery replied. "And I'm okay with that." Holden tilted his head. "Really?" "She doesn't owe me anything," Avery said. "Not a name, not loyalty, not love. She's already been through enough. I'm not here to replace anyone." He watched her for a long moment. "But you're not replacing," he said. "You're becoming." Avery let the words settle. Becoming. Not taking someone's place, but carving a new one of her own. 2 days later, the family took a drive to the small local tree farm. It was Sophie's idea, sparked by a hand-drawn sign taped to the library's front window, "Starlight Pines, cut your own Christmas tree." It was late December already, and though the holidays had been quiet in the Cole house for years, June begged for a real tree, not one from a box, and Sophie wanted to see if the pine trees smelled like the ones in storybooks. The tree farm was modest, tucked at the base of a hill, with rows of blue spruce and Scotch pines dusted in snow. A family from the town ran it, an older couple with red cheeks and thermoses of cider they passed out with warm smiles. Holden held the saw. June and Sophie ran ahead through the trees, pointing and shouting and disagreeing about size and shape. Avery stood beside Holden, glancing around. This is surreal, she said. What is? She gestured around them. All of it. I used to spend my Decembers on base, or in recovery, or nowhere near a Christmas tree. First time for everything, he said. She nodded slowly. I think I forgot how to let good things happen. You'll remember, he said. You're just out of practice. That night, the cabin glowed with light. The girls hung ornaments, paper stars painted bulbs, and a crooked angel June made in kindergarten. Holden set the tree in its stand, stepping back to admire their uneven but heartfelt decorating. Avery placed a single ornament near the top, a small silver star etched with the name Dana. Sophie looked up at her. Is that for my mommy? Avery knelt beside her. Yeah. So she knows she's still part of this. Sophie wrapped her arms around her waist and didn't let go. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep on the couch in a blanket pile of Christmas lights and hot cocoa marshmallow stains, Avery and Holden stood outside again, beneath the same sky. She pointed up. That's Polaris right, he said. The North Star, used for navigation. For centuries, she whispered. Holden looked over. You still feel lost? No, she said, shaking her head. Not lost. Just finally facing the direction I want to go. Holden smiled. Avery turned toward him, her voice barely audible. I'm not asking for anything. Not promises. Not answers. But I want you to know something. What's that? I stopped writing goodbye letters, she said. I started writing grocery lists. He chuckled, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet awe. You're building a life, Avery. Piece by piece, she said. Burnt toast, bedtime books, and Christmas trees. Holden looked at her. Really looked, and for the first time in years, Avery didn't look away. I'd like to be a part of that, he said softly. She smiled. You already are. And above them, the stars didn't just return. They waited. The first days of January brought a stillness to Montana that Avery had never experienced before. The valley seemed to hold its breath, its fields wrapped in white silence, as if honoring the turning of time. Life inside the coal cabin had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. There were lunches to pack, mittens to locate, grocery lists to scribble on the fridge. And there were moments, small, quiet ones, that Avery found herself treasuring more than she'd thought possible. Sophie had begun humming while brushing her teeth. June now insisted on Avery being the one to braid her hair before school, because Dad always pulls too tight. And Holden had learned exactly how she liked her coffee without asking. It wasn't a grand romance, at least not yet. It was something deeper. More lived in, like the way his hand would brush hers when they passed in the hall, or the way they shared glances across the dinner table when the girls started telling knock-knock jokes that made no sense. Love, Avery realized, didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it just never left. That Sunday afternoon, Holden took the girls sledding down the hill behind the barn, giving Avery a rare hour alone in the quiet house. She wandered to the reading nook in the den, once just an empty corner, now filled with children's books, fleece throws, and a well-worn armchair that had become her favorite place to breathe. She sat, pulling her old leather-bound journal onto her lap. It had once been filled with reports, flight logs, survival statistics. Now it held pieces of a new story. Avery opened to a fresh page. Her fingers hesitated above the paper before she began to write. Dear Cole, I haven't written to you in over a year. The last letter I started ended with, I don't know how to live without you. I never mailed it. It's probably still folded inside the lining of my old duffel next to your tag. But I think you'd be okay with that, because I finally understand something. I wasn't meant to carry your legacy like a burden. I was meant to grow from it. You gave your life for mine, and for a long time, I thought that meant I owed the world more than I could give. But now I know what you really gave me, was a second chance, not to save the world, but to belong in it again. She paused, her eyes stinging. There's a little girl here now. Her name's Sophie. She's Dana's, and she's mine too in a way I never expected. I tuck her in at night. I pack her lunch. Sometimes I get it wrong, but she still hugs me goodnight. June does too. She's 8, fierce as a wildfire, and just as brilliant. And Holden, he doesn't try to fix me. He just stays. When I forget how to breathe, he doesn't tell me to try harder. He just waits until I remember I can. Avery let her pen hover for a moment, then kept going. I don't carry your tag anymore. I placed it in a velvet box on a high shelf where it won't be forgotten, but where it won't weigh down my pocket either. I think you'd be proud of me, Cole, not because I became some war hero, but because I started living again, not surviving, not escaping, just living and loving, even if it's still a little messy. She signed her name at the bottom with a shaky breath. Avery Quinn. Then she closed the journal gently, pressing her palm against its cover like a final seal. Outside, the girls' laughter echoed off the hillside, sharp and bright against the cold air. Holden's voice followed, steady and teasing. Avery smiled as she slipped on her coat and stepped into the cold. The sky was that particular shade of wintry blue that felt older than time itself. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed the tracks down to the sledding path. Sophie spotted her first and dropped the sled rope. Miss Avery, watch this. She threw herself belly first down the hill with a shriek of joy. Avery laughed. You're going to outsled me before winter's over. June came barreling next, then Holden, who miscalculated the angle and landed on his back with a grunt and an exaggerated groan. Avery jogged down the slope, kneeling beside him in mock concern. Survivor. He grinned up at her. Only if you help me up. She offered her hand. He took it and didn't let go. I saw you writing earlier, he said softly, brushing snow off his jeans. I wrote, Cole? She replied, her voice quiet but steady. Not because I'm stuck there, but because I'm not. Holden nodded. Did it help? Yes. She smiled faintly. I think I'm finally starting to belong to this life. He didn't respond with words. He simply leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers for a breathless second. No urgency, just presence. Just two people who had learned the hard way how much it meant when someone chose to stay. That night, after the girls fell asleep, tangled in blankets and stuffed animals, Avery wandered out to the barn alone. The air was still the forge, unlit, but the warmth lingered in the walls. She reached up to the high shelf where she had placed the velvet box. She didn't open it. Not this time. Instead, she took the folded letter she had written and placed it beside the tag, two weights finally balanced. Then she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for saving me," so I could find the people who would teach me how to live. And as she turned to leave, she didn't look back, not because she was letting go of the past, but because she was finally walking forward into her future. The airport looked smaller this time, less imposing, less like a place you go to disappear, and more like one you pass through on your way to somewhere real. Avery stood at gate B-17 with her boarding pass tucked neatly inside her wallet. Sophie clutched her hand, swinging her backpack back and forth. June and Holden stood nearby, sipping hot chocolate from paper cups. They were heading to Boston, Avery's first flight since that one, the one where everything had nearly ended and quietly, unknowingly begun. She had accepted an invitation to speak at a military mental health conference, something she never would have considered a year ago. But now, with Holden's quiet encouragement and Sophie's sleepy kiss on her cheek that morning, she felt ready to face the sky again. As the boarding call echoed overhead, Holden stepped closer. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, not doubting her, never doubting her, but offering her a way out just in case. Avery looked at him, her eyes calm. "I need to," she said. "I think it's time I sat in that seat again. Not as a survivor, not as a soldier. Just me." Holden nodded. "I'll be here when you land." She smiled and leaned in to kiss his cheek. "I know." He pulled her into a hug, strong and steady. Then June threw her arms around Avery's waist, whispering, "Bring me back a magnet." Sophie hugged her tighter. "Don't forget your stars." Avery touched the pin on her lapel, a silver star Holden had given her on Christmas Eve. "For courage," he'd said. Now she boarded the plane alone, her heart not heavy but full. She didn't ask for the seat. It was assigned 19A. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of symmetry. As she slid into the place where she had once folded a suicide note with trembling hands, Avery felt something shift. Not dread, not fear, but a soft kind of reverence. The tray table still had the faint scratch she remembered. The window still framed the wing like a portrait. But she was different. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope, printed on the front to the person sitting in 19A. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Hi, if you're reading this, maybe you needed this seat like I did once. Maybe you're tired or broken, or just trying to hold it together until the wheels touch down. If you're feeling like this might be the end, I want to tell you it's not. This seat once held my grief, my silence, my fear. Now it holds my hope. You're not alone. Please stay. Avery Quinn." She tucked the envelope into the seat pocket in front of her, next to the safety brochure and the in-flight magazine. No signature beyond her first name. No explanation. Just an offering left behind, like a breadcrumb for someone else stumbling through the same darkness she had once walked. A voice beside her interrupted the silence. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Avery turned. A woman, maybe early 30s, travel-worn and pale, gestured toward the middle seat. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. Avery smiled gently. "No, please." As the woman sat fumbling with her coat, she caught sight of the letter poking from the seat pocket. Her fingers hesitated, then slowly she slid it out. Avery looked away, pretending not to notice, but in her chest something fluttered. The woman read. Her hands trembled slightly, then steadied. She folded the note back into the envelope and placed it carefully in her purse. She didn't say anything, but she didn't cry again either. When the plane landed in Boston, Avery exited into the terminal with a quiet, grounded calm. She wasn't running anymore. Not from Cole's memory, not from the crash, not from the life that had surprised her by being worth staying for. She rented a car, checked into her modest hotel room, and spent the next day sharing her story with a room full of veterans, nurses, counselors, and young service members. She told them the truth, not the polished version, but the one that cracked open grief and let the light in. When it ended, there were tears. Applause. One young woman came up to her after and whispered, "I was almost done. But then someone told me they'd sit beside me no matter what. It saved my life." Avery smiled and squeezed her hand. "I know that feeling," she said. Back in Missoula 3 days later, she stepped off the return flight and walked into the waiting area, where Holden stood holding 2 cups of coffee and a construction paper sign that read, "Welcome back, 19A." Avery burst out laughing. Sophie ran toward her, arms open. June followed, grinning. As Avery knelt and scooped them both into her embrace, Holden stepped close. "How was it?" "Hard," she said. "And worth it." He handed her a cup. "Your kind of coffee." "1 sugar." "No cream." She sipped. "You remembered." "I always remember." They stood in the middle of the terminal, not caring who walked by. And in that moment, messy, unglamorous, absolutely ordinary Avery knew she wasn't sitting in someone else's life anymore. She had claimed her own. She had stayed. And somewhere in seat 19A on a different flight, maybe someone else was staying too. Winter gave way to spring slowly in Montana. The icicles melted, first trickling into the dry earth beneath the eaves of the cabin. Then came the light, softer, golden painting, long lines across the wooden floors each morning as the sun rose earlier and stayed longer. The valley awakened in layers, saplings reaching skyward streams, unfreezing, and the rustle of branches growing heavy with new life. Inside the Cole home, a different kind of season was changing. Avery stood barefoot on the porch, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, watching June and Sophie chase each other through the budding grass. Their laughter, untamed, bright, and unmistakably free, rose like songbirds in the morning air. Behind her, Holden stepped outside, handing her a fresh cup of coffee. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her shoulder, brushing shoulder like he always had. "They look different," he finally said. Avery smiled. "They're growing. Not just taller." She turned to him, eyes shining. "Neither are we." Holden took a long sip, then leaned against the post beside her. "Do you think Cole would understand that you've moved forward?" Avery looked out toward the trees, where the girls had now flopped onto the grass in a heap of giggles. "I think he hoped I would," she said softly. "He didn't save me so I could stay frozen in time. He saved me so I could live." Holden nodded. "Then I think he's proud." She took a sip of her coffee and whispered, "Me too." That evening, as the sky turned the color of ripe peaches and the wind carried the scent of fresh earth, Avery gathered the family in the barn. A workbench had been cleared, a soft blanket laid over the surface. The velvet box, the one she'd once placed on the high shelf untouched since January, sat in the center. Holden raised an eyebrow as they entered. "This feels ceremonial." Avery smiled, nervous and steady all at once. "It is." She turned to June and Sophie, who now stood quietly beside her. "I want to show you something." She opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was Cole Stone's dog tag, and beside it, the folded letter she had written months ago, the one she'd never mailed, but had finally allowed herself to complete. Sophie stepped forward and touched the tag gently. "Is this your old friend?" she asked. Avery nodded. "He helped me become the person I needed to be here, to be with you." She turned to Holden. "He was my beginning, but he's no longer my anchor." "You are." Holden's breath caught, but he said nothing. He simply reached out and she took his hand. Then Avery reached into her pocket and pulled out something else. 2 custom dog tags. One read, "Sophie Wright, family," the other, "June Cole, family." She knelt and placed them around each girl's neck. "Now we all carry each other," she said. "Not as a memory, not as a rescue, just as home." The girls wrapped their arms around her, a tangle of limbs and hair and breath. Then June piped up, her voice muffled in Avery's shoulder. "So are you going to marry my dad, or what?" Holden nearly dropped the lantern. Avery's eyes widened. "June." "What?" June grinned. "It's a fair question," Sophie chimed in. "I want to wear a dress like in the books, and throw petals." Holden looked from one girl to the other, then at Avery, who was now half laughing, half blushing. "I didn't put them up to it," he said, both hands raised. "I know," Avery said, "but it's not a bad idea." She turned to the girls. "Would you be okay if this family got a little more official, June?" And Sophie shrieked and jumped up and down, their little arms flailing with joy. Holden stepped forward, brushed a strand of hair from Avery's face, and said quietly, sincerely, "I would have waited forever. But I'm glad it didn't take that long." Avery smiled, tears burning behind her eyes. "You didn't wait. You stayed." Weeks passed, and spring burst into full bloom. On a Saturday morning, under the archway of a willow tree behind the cabin, Avery and Holden stood hand in hand, with June and Sophie standing between them in white cotton dresses and wildflower crowns. There were no grand speeches, no violins, just neighbors, friends, and the sound of wind threading through the grass. When the officiant said, "You may now kiss," Holden looked into Avery's eyes and whispered, "We built this piece by piece." She smiled. "Burnt toast, bedtime books, and Christmas trees," she said. And Hopi added. Then they kissed. And somewhere nearby on the front porch of the cabin, a seat had been left empty, not in sorrow, but in reverence, a place for the ghosts who led them here. That night, long after the cake had been eaten and the last lantern dimmed, Avery tucked the girls into bed. Sophie clutched her blue elephant. June had her arms wrapped around her sketch pad, full of messy stick figures and hearts. Avery lingered a little longer than usual, Mom Sophie said softly. Avery froze. She turned. "Yes, sweetheart," Sophie blinked up at her. "I like saying that now." Avery sat beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. "So do I," she whispered. Later in the quiet of the barn, Avery stood alone for a moment, staring at the old forge. She reached into her coat, pulled out a folded note, and placed it beneath a rock on the anvil. To anyone still carrying the weight, you don't have to drop it all at once, just enough to let someone else reach for your hand. Sometimes healing doesn't look like running free. Sometimes it looks like staying. And so she did. A soldier, a mother, a wife, a woman who stayed. And in the stillness, with stars above and new laughter blooming in the home behind her, Avery Quinn finally came home. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. It warms our hearts to see this little community growing across miles and time zones. If this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story for more heartfelt tales of second chances, quiet courage, and the beauty of simply staying. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of your heart and take care of each other.